Good afternoon. Welcome to our brown bag program on June 19th. This is an appropriate day to have a presentation on the Underground Railroad. A few notes before we begin. Please enjoy our quilt exhibits, both here and downstairs. In the gallery behind the reception desk, we have an international quilt exhibit called Tribes, so make sure you see that. Our next program, Brown Bag program, will be on Wednesday, July 10th, and it's entitled Pie, Glorious Pie by Alice Wolfgang. And learn about, we'll be learning about both the dessert and savory pies that are part of the Pennsylvania Dutch traditions and how both bake ovens and wood cook stoves were used to make all these tasty, wonderful treats, guaranteed to make you hungry. Today, our program is on a more serious topic than pies, but I've been looking forward to this presentation by historian Randolph Harris of Lancaster. He is a partner in the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, which is a program of the U.S. Department of the Interior National Park Service. And since 2003, Mr. Harris has been responsible either directly or in collaboration with other historians for the designation of 20 of the approximately 50 sites in Pennsylvania that are now included in the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. He is currently on the staff of Lancaster History, which is developing the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for History and Democracy in downtown Lancaster. So with that, welcome, Mr. Harris.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Beth, and for everybody who came to visit today. Great. This is a wonderful facility. I can't wait to hang around afterwards and see everything that's here. It's just a real treat to be here. I don't usually get calls this great distance to come and do my presentations because not for any particular reason, but the word is getting out. And I'll show you a video here in a little bit to indicate how this story of Underground Railroad, African-American heritage, is finally percolating to a surface of greater consciousness, both here in this region and across the country as well. I also wanted to apologize for my delay in coming here about the mix-up in schedules. I was supposed to be here a couple of weeks ago, but thankfully everything has worked out. So I would invite you to examine this photograph, painting, I'm sorry, from 1840. It just distills Lancaster County and Southeast PA's connection to this remarkable story of social and political movement that we can call the Underground Railroad. And I like to think of it as a movement about moving people from one horrible place of enslavement to some sense of freedom in a different area. So I call it a social political movement about movement in that case. And in this case, this movement took place across the Susquehanna River, the eastern or western edge of Lancaster County, opposite York County. And this location, as you can see by that wooden covered bridge in the distance, you're looking south toward the Chesapeake Bay, 20 some miles from this location. That bridge was installed there in 1814 as a private enterprise by local people who were some of the earliest settlers in the area, who created a pathway that was available all year long, unlike any of the other ferries that were there, more primitive, that would cross the river, this wide, rocky, sometimes very dangerous Susquehanna River. That provided a funnel or a pinch point or a pathway for everybody coming north out of some of the largest plantations in middle Atlantic states in Northern Virginia and Maryland, coming into Pennsylvania in ways that we are still trying to figure out how they got here in all these different conveyances, either walking or whatever way they were able to travel. But when they got here, most of the people heading east wanted to go to Philadelphia. And so, let's look at that a little bit. And what you see here also are other means of transportation. We're talking about transporting people around different ways as a part of this path to freedom. You have the Pennsylvania Canal cut into the hillside there. You have, again, the bridge going across. A rowboat. We know about a black man who took people across the river, sometimes at night, when the bridge was being monitored by the ever-present bounty hunters and slave catchers who roamed this whole area. We have a farmer. We know farmers hid people under their produce wagons as they took them from the farmhouse to a market. So we know that was a part of the conveyance. And the home there we know was the lock tender's house on the Pennsylvania Canal. And that particular family we know to have been involved in anti-slavery activity. So this really distills everything except one thing, the railroad. And we're going to go heavy into the things that are magical, I think, about the railroad in this regard. And it's just going to be quite the, I'm trying to advance the slides. Oh, okay. I'm using the mouse.
Yeah, we take mouse. Use that the first time, then after that.
Oh,
that
okay,
should work better.
Wonderful. See, what you always have to have is someone in the younger generations to handle this. So here we have this region that we just talked about. And you see it goes basically from the Cumberland Valley to the west, all the way to Philadelphia to the east, like 140 miles. And basically along the old US Route 30, the first transcontinental highway, and one of the first turnpikes in the country, the first toll road from Philadelphia to Lancaster, late 1790s, I believe. But in that vein, you see pathways that have been created in the aftermath of the Revolution. 1790s, you see a map like this that indicates some of the earliest ways of transport, which would have been along, of course, the creeks and the valleys and the rivers. But then again, they also had to find ways overland in those early times. So again, this was the first turnpike, the first toll road where you could reliably travel by foot or wagon or horse from Philadelphia to this inland city of some significance, Lancaster. And then a few miles later, 10 or so to the Susquehanna to Columbia. Seems that every map of where historians try to chart and navigate the pathways of the Underground Railroad, which is always a crapshoot, if I could use that crude term. It's the record that we follow is very sparse, unfortunately, and there's a lot of conjecture involved in investigating these sites and these stories. But almost every map that you see, someone tries to capsulize this pathway, this movement. You see Columbia, Lancaster County, at that river crossing where that bridge is located, seems to me, and through my research, to be the epicenter of some of the earliest episodes of this organizational effort to rise up and go against this institution of slavery in the United States. And even National Geographic, which was one of the late 20th century expositions. Is anybody familiar with Charles Blockson, late Charles Blockson? His grandmother was enslaved, and he navigated all over Pennsylvania to every historical society trying to find out what they had on record about Underground Railroad. And he was able to convince National Geographic to do a cover story, and this is what they produced. But you see Columbia is mentioned there, but not Lancaster, not Harrisburg, because again, so many stories emanated from that early community. And in that regard, let me show you this, which was done, I just told my hosts here a little while ago. Did anybody watch any of the coverage of the U.S. Women's Golf Open in Lancaster at the Lancaster Country Club a couple of weeks ago? For some reason, we're still trying to figure this out. The NBC production people from New York called our folks in the community and said, we want to feature Lancaster community as a part of this golf tournament. And we want to focus on the Amish. Ideally, if we can find some Amish folks who golf, which they weren't able to do. And we want to understand Underground Railroad. We hear there's these Underground Railroad stories coming out of Lancaster County. So, of course, they didn't find the Amish storyline that they had preconceived to want to do. So it fell to me and my colleagues at Lancaster History to come up with the photographs and the people to interview and things like that. So this organization called Jumbo Media, I don't know where they get these names, but they did a great job. They're contractors for NBC, and they produced this. And I don't know how many times they aired this thing, but it's 5 minutes. I'd like you to watch it and enjoy, and we'll talk about it later. And hopefully it'll go like that.
I'm thinking there's a group of people who will unify around the common idea that slavery is wrong. We were in a citizen public. We didn't see things and those about. And the honest that those who forget their history tend to repeat it.
It was the first stop on the path. As the best women golfers in the world, the center of Lancaster Country Club, for the 79th U.S. Women's Open. The land on which they will compete is higher ground than more than just saw. The key and the villages and farms that surround it is an important location in the history of our country. Home to a vast network of people and places that helped guide some 100,000 enslaved people free.
The term is important in Lancaster County. The story is that a slave catcher followed fugitives to the Susquehanna and lost all track of them, and said there must be an underground railroad.
There's a great map on this opportunity, and it's a straight line coming across this and then it just explodes in this wide network. Households, farms, individuals, people who are willing to help. For people seeking freedom or escaping bondage, Lancaster was in nothing.
It was this incredible infrastructure of freedmen of color, Quakers, and abolitionists who were not afraid to participate in the underground railroad.
Lancaster and the people who called it their home, serving as willing participants at the time, in the legal activity of helping fugitive slaves.
When they got to the Susquehanna, they thought they were in Canada. They were told, go north until you find this river, and when you cross it, you're safe.
Geographically, you could land here much more quickly than a number of other counties along the border, and you have this cultural makeup. But because there are so many Anabaptists and Quakers who were abolitionists, there was a natural abolition for freedom seekers. So people who are seeking a safe haven can come across the border and find a little bit more readily available sanctuary in the right parts of the key figures in and around this included U.S. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, who was a fierce opponent of slavery and helped draft the 13th Amendment that abolished it. And Black freedman William Whipper Stephen Smith, who was successful businessmen, using their wealth and influence to help. With their success, they're starting to ship lumber materials to places like Philadelphia, all points north, and they have the wherewithal to build compartments in their rail cars to help secret people along the actual railroad to get them to points of greater freedom and safety.
Thousands of slaves come to their home facility, built to freedom community because it felt like the right thing to do. The fact that he was able to leave a legacy of not only success, but helping others in his success and continue to do that throughout his life is really amazing.
It's easy to overlook everything that once happened in the stunning landscape. Easy to live in the here and now. But even moments, the past is something to be taught and remembered. For its story is too important to ever forget.
If we don't turn our gaze toward the past and understand how we came to the moment we're in, we're missing something very important.
We have this opportunity to pause and reflect on our shared history and values of compassion and justice and freedom and equality, and see if the stories inherent in the ground around us can connect to our current lives today.
There's no aspect of the story that hasn't been told. It's a quintessential American story, helping the underdog. It's all an aspect of our history.
They were viewers from the dolphins, look across and see an African American and understand not the position, but the struggle and passage. That's what we make one day.
quite amazing what you can do with drones these days. I'm real. It's just so tricky and so beautiful in so many ways. So hopefully that was a decent introduction to the community, to this history that we'll be going into further here in so many different ways. I've listened to many lectures, read a lot of books, and I've had my Google News alert set to the words Underground Railroad for 20 years, looking for someone to come forth with who came up with that name, which is still a mystery and questioned by a lot of historians, and also who's got the best scholarship on how this thing actually operated. Where did it start? Where did it emanate? How was it organized? We're still trying to piece together that puzzle. But as it is, we have a lot to go on. We have a lot to learn, and we're still learning like every day. What we do know is that people who were enslaved took the first steps to liberate themselves from this horrible institution of slavery. And sometimes they found willing and helpful people along the way, both Black and white. Other times they were on their own and subject to a lot of persecution, torture, marginalization along this path that they took. But what we do know is for our region, there were many pathways all across. It's an international movement, actually, when you consider Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, where people fled to Florida before this was a state. It was a Native American huge enclave, but people left on their own and they were able to move. So with the people who came here, but what we do know is what's interesting is the largest concentration of large plantations existed in the Mid-Atlantic region, and the largest population around the time of the Revolution existed in the Mid-Atlantic region, our region. So when people came into Pennsylvania across the famous Mason-Dixon line, this is the territory they faced. And most of the people who were already here, Black or white, who were willing to help, it wasn't nirvana. I mean, there were slaves in Pennsylvania, in this region, but for the people who were able to help them, that kernel of very valuable knowledge being, how do you get to the next place where someone's going to help me? And that's what was able to be passed along this pathway. But most people wanted to get to Philadelphia. And why? Because of those early transportation routes. First, Native American pathways, then later highways and other conveyances, as we talked. But the words were written on the immortal paper in Philadelphia, right? It's the seat of the government. They had where the first president lived. And it was the largest concentration of freed Africans in North America at the time. So you could get help and freedom. And then from there, you could get north to wherever you wanted to go that was farther away from where you were enslaved. And of course, Harriet Tubman and all the folks who came from the Eastern Shore of Maryland went due north to Philadelphia and met some of the first anti-slavery societies there, and then were able to direct people north from there. And then we also had these same pockets of assistance along these valleys along the way to the west, to the 6 counties out to that ridge, this big ridge of the Appalachians. But consider in that time period, there wasn't much above. And in this time period, I'm speaking of in the aftermath of the Revolution, the formation of the Constitution. Those days, there was little above that large ridge that kind of crowns where Harrisburg is today. It was filled with hostile Native Americans and wild animals and the most horrible terrain you can think of to try to gain passage because you were told to go north, follow the North Star. But when you got there, again, you found people that directed you to the right or to the east where we are. And again, that crossing York and Lancaster counties at that location seems to have been this pinch point and funnel where many people came. We don't know the numbers. We'll never know the numbers probably, but we do know that many people came here and created those stories that we're still telling today. They had an early bridge, 1814, was knocked down by a big ice flow. They rebuilt it in 1832, and that's what you see the second bridge or new bridge there connecting the 2 towns. It's interesting statistics. How many of you have been to the new African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington? Smithsonian on the Mall? Anybody? Well, you go there and it's remarkable. I mean, from top to bottom, remarkable to understand where Black men and their families aligned during the Revolution. Those are the numbers. Joining the British, or would you join the British, or would you fight for the colonials in that span of 8 years or whatever this period of the Revolution? You were probably rolling the dice to go with the Brits, and that's the numbers show it, because they were just telling everybody, we're dismantling slavery now. Canada's going to be a free province. And so you fight with the other guys, the ragged rebels, then you don't know what your family's going to end up doing in the future. So, but think about all the other people that were support people. Those plantation officers in Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, they brought their own whole staffs of enslaved Black people to help them along the way in the military campaigns, whether they were wagon drivers, cooks, valets, whatever work needed to be done, those people came. And that's how they learned that there was something off of the plantation, because they were told for their entire lives, there's nothing for Black people in this country. You're here, you're mine, and you're staying here. Then they found out that there were Black people living in some form of relative freedom in places like Pennsylvania. And that's how I believe the tracks and the trails of this early passageways were created by the movement of those armies, the knowledge, the conveyance, oral tradition passed down. Those are the numbers. Horrible to think about that the most valuable thing that people possessed in those times was another human being. A couple of more stats there. So you see the numbers, the millions of people enslaved versus the population. See a lady taking photographs, please feel free to do that. That's really cool if you want to, because a lot, I always put up, somebody corrects me all the time. You put up too many words on your screen sometimes. But I also have some posters up here like I can share, and you can also take photographs with them at your convenience. So my understanding through whatever I've been told or been learned is that this was the main motivator why people decided they could not stay in enslavement more than the next instant. To have your family torn apart, whether husband or wife or kids, at the drop of a hat. When they would hear that this was maybe coming up, when master was losing his money or needed some money, that was always the edge that people were feared a lot. So that's what made them to just take off and fight whatever they could way to freedom. Somehow in the late 30s, early 1840s, is the rise of the railroad and the use of the metaphorical terminology to connect this social and political movement to the actual actions and movements of the railroad. And of course, when you put something in print, depict something in art or photography, early photography, it really does give credibility, stature, and credence. This is the way it is. Think of what does hell look like to you folks? It looks like Gustave Doré's Dante's Inferno illustrations, right? I mean, you get something in print early and it gets emblazoned in people's minds. And that's what they did with this railroad motif back then in the abolitionist press. And these gentlemen were the first chroniclers of national stature who wrote more of these stories, but it was always in the late 1800s when most of these things came out. William Still was the first out of the gate in terms of a major publication, 1872. William Still, Philadelphia chronicler, head of the Vigilance Committee there, or secretary to the Vigilance Committee, received hundreds of people in his office and gave them support and assistance so they could move on. And he documented who they were, where they came from, their names. And of course, he was lucky enough to save his material until after the Civil War and after things kind of settled down, early 70s. And think about this, the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, Black men got the right to vote. All men got the right to vote, regardless of previous servitude. That, in everything I'm coming to understand, is the reason that these books started to come out. The newspaper articles were starting to be written. Speeches were being made at public rallies claiming admission and involvement in this thing called the Underground Railroad, which was, of course, illegal. So it was giving license to full citizenship to the broad range of the country that allowed people to feel more free to tell these stories that they and their parents were involved. And out of that mix and storytelling came stories, mythology, and kind of made up stuff, because it was cool and humanitarian to have been involved in this activity, you or your grandparents or parents, previous years, 40, 50 years prior. And so then every little cubbyhole started becoming, maybe grandma had an Underground Railroad safe house here. And so you have to separate the wheat from the chaff when you're looking at this stuff. Even these are all reminiscences and oral traditions that most of these people, although we do have a couple of really gems. But this is the guy, the chronicler of Lancaster County's activities, Samuel Evans, a radical Republican, friend of Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War veteran, a political animal, if I could use that term, a magistrate in the town of Columbia for years, collected volumes of information and started publishing even before William Still. This one article here that he wrote in the local paper, calling Columbia this big rendezvous point and this depot of the Underground Railroad, and the fact that Mr. Whipper and Smith, as we saw in the video, used their actual above ground railroad train cars to spirit people from Columbia through Lancaster to Philadelphia. How many people? We don't know. We know they had 22 train cars that they used, but this is the first documented piece of evidence, even though it's a newspaper article, that says these are the guys who were involved, and they used the actual railroad. Now, we also have a letter from William Whipper, and you saw in amazing that we were able, through linkages of connections of people, find a direct descendant of William Whipper, who's now working with us on a number of different projects and who appeared in the video there. She's an artist from Baltimore. Again, I talked about the elevation of this story. These stories really did not emerge after they came out in the late 1800s. They didn't really emerge until after the civil rights movement, and because we kind of began to realize there's an entire disaffected population in the United States in the aftermath of the riots of the 60s and the whole tumultuous activities of the Vietnam War. And we needed to have understanding of where these people came from. Yes, ma'am, you have a question?
There's a book that I just read a lot of stories of children and that's fabulous.
Okay. Oh, okay. Is it fiction or nonfiction? Okay, great. Okay.
But that, you know, I have friends who used to go to the yard sales and look at this stuff and take that data for me.
Okay. Okay.
And anytime I went into classrooms, I would meet them there because it's just beautiful.
It is a good piece, indeed, indeed. But it has one of the biggest nuggets of mythology in it. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But thank you for that point. So we have the Pennsylvania experience, I think, can be distilled down to, I'm sorry, we will get to questions and answers when I'm done in a short while, maybe in 20 more minutes, and then we'll have time for talking. Pennsylvania, again, geography and these factors are what made Pennsylvania and this southeast corner of Pennsylvania such a magnet and such a concentration of these activities. And we'll go into those features as we go through this. So again, we covered geography pretty much of this pathways coming north and east. Along that same map we see over there, again, I invite you to take photographs of that. That's in the 1898 book by Wilbur Siebert, based on Robert Smedley, who was the chronicler of mostly the Quakers. And he's faulted with not giving much coverage at all to Black people. It's all about Quakers from Dr. Smedley from Chester County. But he wrote about this region, and it's still a body of good information. We have William Penn's imprint on the land, of course, the only colony that allowed any faith community to set up their facilities for worship. Unlike any of the other colonies, you had to be aligned to a certain Christian denomination. This was part of the, what I call a cultural DNA of this Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and particularly this earliest settled territory in the Southeast. But at the same time, you have Lancaster County, and I'm sure Montgomery and York and all these counties in the area have numbers like this that and show that people were enslaved here, because I can't tell you how many times I do tours and presentations. You have slavery in Pennsylvania, you know, that it's still not there. Also, the other, in terms of public policy, why Pennsylvania was so important, the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, which the first unit of government in the Western Hemisphere to officially begin the dismantling of the institution of slavery. And of course, unfortunately, the act of the legislature of Pennsylvania, at the same time, remember, the Constitution is being formed, decided to dismantle slavery gradually, obviously, because I don't know if they called people abolitionists in the 1780s, but later. But if you believed in the immediate dismissal or the immediate abolition of slavery, you were the most extreme person that you can possibly think of. Your views were discounted. You were marginalized. You had no quarter in the public square if you believed that. Because why? Because enslaved people were the most valuable thing that everybody had, and this institution was so ingrained into this country and other parts of the world. Getting rid of that economic structure was abhorrent to just a huge number of people. So gradually, if you were born before 1780 in Pennsylvania, you would be enslaved for life. If your children were born after 1780, they were given the glorious opportunity to become in freedom, have freedom after age 78. I'm sorry, not 78, 28. Sorry, folks, I didn't mean to say that. Strike that from the record. But 28, think about that. Not too many people lived past age 28 back then, especially after a lifetime of hard labor. So, but at that point, there was still a glimmer of hope. You could also, if you were savvy enough, skilled enough, you could barter and buy your time, or find someone to buy your time for you to get out of that other form of slavery, which is what it was. So again, even after the Gradual Abolition Act, you had these kind of numbers of people existing in Pennsylvania in our area who were dealing with this perpetually recycled institution. So what do we consider about technology? The fourth of the four categories that I feel constitute the attraction of this Southeast area. Technology is transportation, in this case, infrastructure as we call it today. The first ferry that crossed the Susquehanna, or maybe the first or second, at Harrisburg was one, and at Wrightsville or Wrights Ferry, that was the seed of the transportation network and the eventual building of the bridges we talked about before. The original bridge and the second bridge, the longest wooden covered bridges in the world at the time were built there. And they were built with virgin timber that which floated down the Susquehanna River from up in the upper reaches of the Susquehanna by a lot of strong men, many of whom were formerly enslaved. And this is the bridge they built, looking north from the York County side, heading north. A wooden covered bridge that, as I said, after 20 some years, it was knocked down by an ice flow, massive ice flow. But the families of the Wright Quaker settlers were the original settlers who set much of this in motion. Of course, they were humanitarians and egalitarians. Some of the partners they brought with them from Philadelphia and Chester County to head out to Lancaster County to form that community. Some of them enslaved people, but nowhere near did we have in these families, in these communities, massive plantations with hundreds of people. Although, you know, in Towson, Maryland, just south of the Mason-Dixon line, there's a National Park Service site, the Ridgely Plantation, if anybody's ever been there, that close to Pennsylvania, at the height of operations of that massive thousands of acres of facility, they enslaved 500 people at that one farm, or that one family farm, over many generations. So it wasn't that far away that we had major concentrations like that. And of course, this gentleman, Mr. William Wright, is the guy, the grandson of the founder of the town, who was the man who was the most instrumental, the most reviled, had the worst reputation, according to the slave owners and the slave catchers, for facilitating so many paths to freedom for so many people. Him and his wife, Deborah Parrish Wright, she comes from the same family from Maxwell Parish, from the Philadelphia area. Probably well off enough to have a photograph made, because this had to be one of the earliest photographs at that time period. And you can see it does look rather primitive. But he's the guy. He's the guy who really facilitated. He's credited in many, many national books of the Underground Railroad with coming up with this notion of working with the Quaker families, because they were all interrelated. They all had the monthly meetings, and quarterly meetings, and annual meetings. They all kept it in the family. If you know the Quaker community, which I'm sure some of you do, that's how we believe that the secrets were kept about who was involved with this activity. Because again, the Quakers had their progressive branch as well as the more conservative branch. And so there was all that Nicene activity going on at the same time. So railroads, canals, and inclined planes we need to talk about, because this is the transportation infrastructure that was used as part of what we call the main line of public works. You're familiar with the main line outside of Philadelphia? The name comes from this original infrastructure that was set in motion in 1834, the main line of public works that could get you by train, inclined plane, or canal from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. I'll show you the graphic will astound you. But the rise of the railroad, the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, this first 80-mile leg of this early primitive railroad, the second operating railroad that I am understanding to have operated in the country, hauling freight and passengers on a regular basis, followed by the Baltimore, Ohio, a couple of years earlier. This leg of this railroad was used by the state of Pennsylvania. It was owned by the state of Pennsylvania, and it was very primitive. I mean, can you imagine riding? And they kind of put stagecoaches on there with metal wheels. And the guy who was driving the thing was outdoor all weather, with smoke and soot and fire coming out of that belly of that thing, and coating people's clothes and setting them on fire. There's some stories like that. I mean, very, very early and very primitive. But it got, as technology evolved, it got better and better. So all of that together, according to Dr. Smedley here, he's one of the first ones who chronicled, as you heard Dr. Hopkins, my colleague in the video, talking about the slave catcher coming across the bridge from the western counties to cross the bridge to Columbia, this town where all this activity was occurring. Slave catchers are fraught with frustration because the people they were tracking seemed to disappear when they got to a town of Columbia. And Smedley writes that they seem to have, this slave catcher, again, drives you crazy as a historian because he doesn't say who the guy was or what year he supposedly said it, but it's a reminiscence many years later. This enslaved person must have disappeared, must have gone off on an underground railroad. So Smedley putting that in print in 1883 is one of the little nuggets that kind of builds this mystique about that community. And again, it's apocryphal. You know, you can't really hang a word on the wall about it, but it's a part of the mix, because Ohio has a similar story and Washington, D.C. area has a similar story as well. So again, we're still looking for who coined it, who put it in print, because it will give you a mark in time as to when this movement occurred. And as again, in the video, we show these two gentlemen, Whipper and Smith, became probably in the top 3 or 4 wealthiest Black businessmen in the years before the Civil War, based on their railroad operations, their business of milling lumber on the shores of the Susquehanna River, warehousing coal, because they were using some of the earliest stationary steam engine driven lumber mills to cut these massive virgin timbers that they were floating down the river. Employing many, many Black men, giving these families who were formerly enslaved, many of them, the first opportunity to earn wealth through their own labor, and also beginning to build a societal formation around church communities, owning property. We have some of the earliest records here of property ownership by Black people. And of course, that gave rise to a lot of jealousies in the white community. So by the 1830s, there were anti-Black riots all over the urban areas of America, New York and Philadelphia, and this little town of Columbia. So it was fraught with danger and a bad situation. But the Quaker community and these two wealthy guys had allies in the community, and they were able to enlist the nascent law enforcement that existed at the time, and they put down that rebellion in that community. So a lot of dynamic stuff going on there. When you came across the river in Columbia, this is what you found: a row right along the railroad tracks of houses, hotels, taverns, any number of which you were told to kind of go in there and someone will help you in some way, shape, or form. Again, with that most valuable piece of information, how do you get to the next site? So this is Whipper and Smith. That's their lumber yard. We're lucky enough to have an actual photograph of their building on the riverfront. You see the Whipper down there underneath the photograph. It's where the lumber office was, and that row of houses along the way there. And if you look at the names, S. Smith, S. Smith, S. Smith, that's Stephen Smith, the partner here in the lumber operations, and T. Stevens, that is our friend Thaddeus Stevens, who had just moved from Gettysburg as a successful lawyer, former state legislator, the man who is credited with almost single-handedly turning back the tide of dismantling the early free public education system in Pennsylvania. And Stevens on his deathbed said that despite the fact that he was involved with constitutional amendment creation and nurturing, his saving public education in Pennsylvania, he claims, as he was passing, was his greatest accomplishment. So Stevens buys a property here. We don't know, he didn't live there, we know that. He obviously rented it out, but he's credited here on this early map, which is pretty decently documented, of having that property there. So why would this guy coming into Lancaster and putting his office in downtown set up a place in this hotbed of Underground Railroad and anti-slavery activity? One of the reasons that we believe is that when he was in his coming out of being a legislator, coming into this community, he was a member of the Pennsylvania Canal Commission, a couple of people appointed by the governor at the time to decide where this massive amount of public works is supposed to be operated. Where the right of, and let me give you that again now, in terms of the operations of the secret people in the compartments of the lumber cars. The way this state main line of public works operated was the state of Pennsylvania owned the right of way. They owned the steam engines. They employed the conductors and the engineers. If you hauled passengers or freight, you had to build your own train cars to the specifications of the state railroad, and you paid a fee to the state of Pennsylvania for attaching your car to the state engine, to the state railroad, and you got back and forth to Philadelphia. And this is how they operated. So this is how we think they were able to spirit people into these compartments, because they were privately owned cars. They built a false wall inside the train cars, probably enough room, not much wider than that, for a couple of people, 3 or 4, to sit. And it took lightning speed, 8 hours to get to Philadelphia from Columbia. So Stevens, back to being a canal commissioner, this was the big patronage network that he set up. This is how he built his political base, because he decided who got the contracts, who got the jobs on the state railroad, and where the passageways were going, who was going to get improvements that were built along the way, who was going to get a bridge over the canal, because it was a formidable thing. Once they cut those canals, it was kind of tough to get your wagons across or just walk across. So if you had a bridge, you were able to get approved. That was gold for those people back then. He was the controlling person who did that. And we believe, this is total speculation, he would have been in a position to hire these people who worked on that railroad so that they kind of looked the other way when they were fooling around with those train cars. Of course, that's my interpretation. So take it for your grain of salt or whatever that thing is all about. So again, Evans is the guy, chronicled these guys early, creating these train cars with the false wall inside. And that's just, it's an artist's conception of an artist friend of ours who kind of came up with that. But that's the first time that this thing is documented, at least in a newspaper article. And then William Whipper comes along in a letter to William Still, who everybody regards as the authority of the first out of the gate national book about the Underground Railroad. William Whipper writes to his friend, because they were associated by then in this time period, they were all living in Philadelphia. He writes that the road forked at Columbia. Some people we sent in the boats and some people we sent in our cars to you in Philadelphia. So a letter is a pretty solid evidence that this is what Mr. Whipper was involved in, as he was still involved in managing the lumber business in the years leading up to the Civil War. Yeah, long letter, really wonderful letter. So here we have the main line of public works and how it operated and what means it was used, the first leg being trains, canals, then up over the Allegheny Ridge in the middle of the state of Pennsylvania with the highest ridge of the Alleghenies at the Allegheny Ridge National Historic Site, and then down to Pittsburgh, Johnstown, Hollidaysburg to Pittsburgh from there. About 400 miles. And it would take you over this, here's the terrain that they had to deal with. And I just cannot even begin to imagine how they'd operated this, built this whole system and had stationary steam engines that lifted you up on platforms on these big wooden canal boats up over the ridge and down, put into these canals. And so you could do it in 3.5 days if you were lucky. They couldn't do it all year long, right? Because of the weather, the canals were freezing. You only can operate this whole system, which is another reason why it didn't last. Eventually, the state of Pennsylvania sold it to the new Pennsylvania Railroad, and all those assets and all that right-of-way was taken over by the railroad. So, I'm not sure what's happening here. Okay, well, the back picture didn't pop up. Oh, there it is. Ooh, someone did some animation for me. I didn't even do that. That's pretty good. Okay, so extension. By 1840, they put railroad tracks across that bridge so that people could go west. And the first town they would hit would be the city of York, the county seat of the capital of York. And there we would find Mr. William Goodrich, another Black businessman who was able, through dint of hard driving, being educated, learning some skills, he ends up building the tallest building on the square in York City at the time. His sons set up a photography studio in the roof of this whole place. He has 13 train cars. They're called Berthen cars. And we understand we were able to document his house, which is here on Philadelphia Street. Document his house. His house was a safe house, as well as his use of his own train cars that went from York City to Wrightsville on the Columbia or Susquehanna River, over to Columbia, and then on to Philadelphia, back and forth, probably in league with Whipper and Smith, but we don't have documented connections to those guys. So wrapping up here, where we are today, the National Park Service, which I'm pleased to be able to work with as a private citizen. Every time I'm introduced as a partner in this network to freedom, it almost sounds like I'm a Park Service employee with a Smokey the Bear hat on. But no, I do this as an independent consultant, and anybody can do this. Like you can do any National Register nominations to get your property listed for that honorific title, which doesn't necessarily come with any protections, but it gives you the sanction that the National Park Service has reviewed your evidence, and they have decreed that it's a valid association to the Underground Railroad. So that's what I've been working on for a number of years. We got the train line, the existing right-of-way of Amtrak from Lancaster to Philadelphia designated as an Underground Railroad pathway to freedom. And that was in 2010. So it's, and I challenge you, if you ride that train line, just ask any conductor if they've ever heard this story before. And I'll bet you probably say they have no idea what you're talking about. Because we have tried valiantly to get some work with Amtrak to kind of do a training session for the folks who work the line. We have not been successful. So you also have to understand Gettysburg happened because of what happened at Columbia and Wrightsville and the burning of that second bridge. Does anybody know that story? Sure, okay. See the good couple of hands going up. It's just this phenomenal circumstance. That second bridge, this wooden covered bridge they built, June of 1863, this is bridge burning weekend coming up in Columbia this weekend, or next weekend, I'm sorry. 4 days before Gettysburg happened, the Confederate Army were trying to come across that bridge because it was the only way that you could get those heavy army guys and their wagons and equipment across. They had to go there. They were going to invade Lancaster. Harrisburg would have sacked Philadelphia. They would have threatened the capital from above. That was part of the pincer movement that the Lee's army was trying to set up. But the Union Army and a bunch of ragtag militia people, students from Millersville University and Franklin and Marshall College, not too many regular army guys, and a cadre of black foundry workers were all called up to stop those guys as best they could from coming across. They were ordered to blow up the bridge with dynamite, just the first couple of sections on the Wrightsville side, the western shore. The thing was so strong, it only blew the roof off, but it didn't knock the deck down to stop the movement across the bridge. So they were ordered to put more charges on it and coat the rest with coal tar and then ignite it. And the story goes, a black man with a cigar lit the fuse or just he threw a thing into the volatile stuff and it burned. It started burning and it burned the entire bridge because the westerly winds took the bridge all the way across and burned it. It's a privately owned bridge and there was never any reparations for that, unfortunately. So all we have left are the piers that go across, the 27 stone piers that go across. The ruins of the canal you can see are still in the woods there along the riverfront. We were able to get this designated by the Park Service, these ruins, as pathways to freedom of the Underground Railroad because of these stories we just shared. And in maybe 5 years, that riverfront will be turned into a riverfront park with trails and interpretive signage. You'll be able to walk through there and check it all out. And the other big item that we always talk about is also in the Network of Freedom is the Christiana riot, which we now call the Christiana Resistance, of that notable date of September 11th, 1851. In the aftermath of the Fugitive Slave Law enacted 10 months prior to this, this confrontation took place between a slave owner, Mr. Gorsuch from Maryland, and his son, and a cadre of U.S. Marshals and a few other folks tried to come back and recapture some black men who had escaped and were living on the farmhouse of the tenant farmer, a black militia organizer called William Parker. Melee happened. Nobody knows who fired the first shot. Gorsuch is killed and his son is badly wounded. And this event happened in 1851, as I said, and it was heralded around the country. Thaddeus Stevens was one of 2 or 3 co-counsels for the defense of these people who were charged with treason against the United States, and they ended up all being acquitted. And that was one of the trigger tipping points, you might call it, in the lead up to the Civil War. This was the Fugitive Slave Law that the Southern folk had instituted at the federal level that was supposed to be their remedy for being able to capture anybody they wanted who fled enslavement under their ownership. This allowed anybody to come north and grab any person who had been on the run and take them back. This proved that you couldn't get someone convicted in Pennsylvania because the sympathies that were here. And it, again, enraged the Southern people because they thought they had the magic bullet to stop the Underground Railroad and stop slavery. They brought them back. And that ended up 10 years later, Civil War. And by the way, John Wilkes Booth was the friend of the younger son of Mr. Gorsuch, who was killed in Maryland. They were in boarding school together. And the young son, Thomas Gorsuch, his father's killed, his big brother's almost hacked to death and shot. And no one's acquitted. No one's convicted for these crimes. So that murder, that activity, enraged young Thomas Gorsuch and the entire boys' boarding school, including one John Wilkes Booth, who wrote in his biography, or someone wrote about him in his biography, that was one of the things that radicalized him as a young man, because he was 12 or 14, whatever years old. So we were able in 2006 to open a small visitor center in the only building in Christiana that had a standing today that had a connection to this tumultuous event. And that's where all the people who were arrested, 38 black men and 3 white men, were brought to this hotel along the railroad tracks that we're still talking about. And they were then interviewed and hauled off to Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia for trial a couple of months later. Thaddeus Stevens interviewed the guys there. Mr. Gorsuch's body was taken there to be shipped back to Maryland. So it has tangible connections to this turning point event. So the trains, again, coming into Lancaster is what we were talking about before. The trains used to come right through the middle of town and with carrying those people along the way. So we were able to get, unfortunately, the parking garage where the old train station was located. We were able to get instituted some historical markers inside of there to tell this story because no one knew this story until about 10 years ago. We started documenting it and telling it and doing tours. This is our president of the African American Historical Society, Nelson Pillay, who's on our board of directors, giving a tour there a couple of years ago. So around the corner up the street from that site, you can see where Thaddeus Stevens is buried at Shriner Concord Cemetery, which is the only cemetery in Lancaster that accepted people of all races and religions at the time. That's why he chose to be buried there. And every year on April 4th, or around April 4th, his anniversary of his birth, we have a commemorative ceremony there at his grave site. So wrapping up, and we're almost done, not bad in time. I just wanted to quickly show you what we're doing with the home and law office of Thaddeus Stevens in downtown Lancaster. We're in the final throes of a $20+ million capital campaign to purchase, well, we're not purchasing this. These are owned by the Lancaster County Convention Center Authority. They're under a 99-year lease to Lancaster History, our organization, to develop this as the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for History and Democracy. Did anybody get a chance to see the video that I think I suggested that we look at in advance? I don't know if we emphasize that. Okay, you can look on YouTube. It's called Thaddeus Stevens, America's Forgotten Hero. YouTube will just pop right up. When these buildings were threatened with demolition in year 2000, I was working for a local preservation group, and our board of directors said, we have to do something about this because one, Thaddeus Stevens is too important a historical figure to be thrown in the dustbin of history, and his home and law office, the only thing standing, nothing left of his presence in Gettysburg to speak of, nothing left in his birth site, which is in Vermont. This home and law office would be the most reasonable, tangible place to tell his story. But we can't tell his story without the story of Lydia Hamilton Smith, the woman of color who lived with him for the last 20+ years of his life. And as we have come to understand, kept him alive in the last 6 years of his life because his internals were just shot by then at age 75 or so, 76. He was a bachelor congressman. He was caring for his orphan nephews. Mrs. Smith came in the late 1840s as to become his housekeeper and property manager. She brought with her as a widow, a recent divorcee, then widow, her 2 sons. So she managed the household with his mixed family, as we would call it today. And she and their lifestyle together seems to have emerged as the main target for his political enemies to go after him. Because as a rising politician, why are you living in this strange situation with a woman of color and kids running around? I mean, this is just not the kind of prescription or pedigree you'd think that a rising politician would hang his hat on. But they persevered and they stayed together in Washington, D.C. and here. And it's a remarkable story. But our community didn't really care much about him, like national history. You'll never hear virtually, the standard history books don't go into Thaddeus Stevens too much. But lately, yes, kind of rising notions of awareness. This is what his house was butchered into by 19 whatever. It was actually hacked up like that in 1920 something or another. But it was in this condition in 1983 when it was being torn down for this convention center project. And the portions of the preservation community came together to stop it. And we were able to do that. And we were able to do that principally because of this archaeological dig in the backyard. One of the last things I did with the organization I was working for was call together. I was recommended to call James Dell and Marianne Levine from Franklin Marshall College and James Dell from Kutztown University to just do a dig in the backyard and look for whatever they could find. And they found these underground water holding tanks called cisterns that collected rainwater, maybe also had spring water that came up, and it was the domestic water supply for the law office and house and for the tavern next door that Thaddeus Stevens owned and rented out. They found artifacts inside of there that tell the great story of the people that were there. But the point being is the buildings were just, marginal to most people. They didn't look at these buildings and think, oh, historic building, like you do normally, because they were pretty butchered up. And again, this kind of semi-tawdry reputation of Stevens and Smith also was part of this whole, why do we care about these people and who are they anyway, kind of an attitude in Lancaster City and Lancaster County, even though the reputation and activity that he had. But this activity of finding this cistern really kind of galvanized attention, great press coverage and community support that stopped the demolition and then allowed us some time to figure out some ways to save it. And so everybody got on the same page and realized that this can be a great asset to this downtown draw, which it has become, of having an attraction that you can come and see. So it's been 20 years in the making, and thankfully Lancaster History stepped up. And leadership and the board there got together and said, we can raise the money, we can make this happen and commemorate these people appropriately for the first time in their lives. This is the great tribute from Frederick Douglass. I don't want to read that whole thing, but he basically said Stevens was the guy in the Congress at the time, even more powerful than the president and cabinet. So Stevens is credited with being like what I call the Malcolm X to Lincoln's Martin Luther King. Like Mr. Lincoln was kind of middle of the road guy trying to play all sides, but Stevens and Senator Sumner from Massachusetts and the other radical Republicans pushed Lincoln to do the things we revere for him doing today, abolishing slavery and making all that in motion. Citizenship, again, Brown versus Board of Education, 1950s, Thurgood Marshall, birthed right out of Thaddeus Stevens, which is he's credited with being one of the main authors of the 14th Amendment. Citizenship, birthright citizenship, equal protection under the law. And the two sub-elements of that constitutional amendment that we don't talk about too much until recently, wherein section 3, you cannot take a job with the federal government if you have been declared as being an insurrectionist or a seditionist. That was recently mulled around here in current thinking. And again, then the other thing he wanted to do was a very subtle but powerful line that Stevens was credited with, the fourth section of the 14th Amendment. The debt of the United States shall not be questioned. I think that's pretty much all it says, very much. And what did that mean? The Southern guys, the Confederates, were trying to get back into Congress and pass laws that would have given them reparations for having lost their property, human property, and their physical property. They wanted the United States to go into debt to pay them back. And Stevens was the guy who said, are you kidding me? You think you guys wanted to leave the country. You wanted your whole form based on slavery, and we're going to pay you back for what you did. So he puts that in there, and that stayed at least for a while, and then allowed Reconstruction to be born out of that amendment. But then again, also then Stevens passes away in 68, and it took until 1870 for the 15th Amendment. But he set all this in motion. There were many, many allies that got the drift of where the country needed to go. And Mrs. Smith, as I said, savvy businesswoman, she got $5,000 from Stevens' estate and used it to buy the property that they lived in downtown Lancaster. Allowed her son to set up a barbershop in this old Thaddeus Stevens law office. And she became a successful businesswoman in Washington, D.C. and ran a massive boarding house until she passed away in 1884. And she kept a room back in Lancaster to come back and visit friends. And was just a stellar person in the community, both in D.C. and here. And again, kept Stevens alive when he had to be on the public stage to pass all those amendments and be the public person that he was at the time. So all this comes down to how do we commemorate these people in these, what had been these semi-rundown buildings in downtown Lancaster. Ralph Applebaum and Associates are the exhibit designers we've been working with for the last couple of years to create this space. They're the folks who designed the African American Museum of History and Culture in DC, the Constitutional Center in Philadelphia, the Holocaust Museum, and hundreds of these museums all across the world. So you're going to come in over a glass floor and you're going to see those cisterns down below this archaeological dig into the Welcome Center. Go into the old tavern next door and get a sense of what the community was all about in circa 1850. Stevens Law Office is one of the sections we're going to really try to recreate because the other areas are going to be experiential, immersive, projections and soundscapes because we can't, there's so little left, unfortunately. This is a testimony to how little anybody regarded Stevens back then. This is the parlor that's going to be recreated to a small theater that will be changed with projections and all kinds of things. We will give tribute to all these abolitionists that are there that are going to be in the lower levels of the buildings there on these large panels. And we'll explain slavery in the North in these lower galleries and in the areas below. And then kind of other small theaters and immersible space where there'll be many things to learn and experience for people of all ages. And then when you get down to the lower level, under what we're calling this modern exhibit area, this is where the constitutional amendments will be explained. And there will be community meeting space where people can come together and launch tours and have dialogue about what it means to be a citizen in a democratic republic. That's what we hope to accomplish by having people go through all of this immersive experience, then realize the value of our Constitution and those civil rights amendments of the 1860s and the role of these people involved. So I'm done. I'm sorry, I went a little long. I hit the 1 hour move, but I'm here to answer questions and give feedback. But thank you. Dr. Lang. I appreciate your time and your attention and appreciate having the opportunity to be with you today. So any questions? I'm sorry, we still have time for questions, Beth? Sure. Anybody? Yes, ma'am. Of people wanted to be known to be involved in this activity. And if there was a person in the late 1800s who talked about their parents or grandparents, they may have passed on an oral tradition to say that maybe they were involved in this. And some of these hiding places have been conjectured as being, like we talked about, this cistern. The cistern, by the way, is a conjectured archaeological theory. They believe that that cistern was modified after they didn't need to hold rainwater in there anymore, and that they seemed to be a space where people could have hidden. So that's an example. Different kind of rooms. Oh, ma'am, you mentioned the nugget of mythology in the Charles Blockson story about Underground Railroad on the front cover of National Geographic. He went to Gettysburg, and some tavern owner there told him that this little panel under the staircase was where they hid the slaves. There's no evidence whatsoever about that, but National Geographic took a picture of it because they told that story and put it in there, and it became the calling card for that place to become a draw in Gettysburg to say this was an Underground Railroad site. Quilts are total mythology. There is nothing in any of the record about quilts being used as directional signals and all that. So if anybody tries to tell you that, you can go to any authority who knows about this subject material, and they will tell you there's nothing to that. There may have happened in one little family, in one little area, one of the Carolinas, according to a book that was written, again, because it got into a book and it seemed to get credible. Yes. In the exhibit that I believe he will be. Yes, you mean that big panel where they showed the network of abolitionists? That was a rendering that was done 2 years ago, and so some of the people who will be depicted are not going to be. So we're going to have those people are going to be shown as being part of a movement. Like William Whipper was really a great orator and writer on the moralistic underpinnings of the anti-slavery movement. So he's going to exemplify that. And on the back of that panel, there'll be other people who acted in that capacity. And so there's opportunities. And I think Garrett is one who will be shown on the back of one of these panels. I'm sorry, repeat the question. Will the Stevens and Smith Center depict Thomas Garrett and any other people you're concerned about, or? He's right there. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
He was just a basic guy. Arrested and said, well, we're going to take the business away. I was like, so what?
He didn't care, right? He moved on. Yep. Yep. Well, I know he's depicted in the National Museum, and he's probably in the one in Cincinnati, which is called the National Underground Railroad Museum. I'm pretty sure he's there. Yeah, there's only so much space, though. You know, these places, we have 25,000 square feet in those old buildings in the corner of the convention center block downtown. I invite you to come visit. Our website's up here. I do tours of both downtown area as well as conduct tours on a regional basis, going out to the towns of Columbia and Wrightsville and going on back roads to come into the city. There's that visitor center in Christiana, which you can go on an appointment anytime. So there's places to explore, which, by the way, this center we're hoping will become like the Harriet Tubman Museum on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which is where the National Park Service is telling the national story. To go there and then to learn about these subject material and then to go explore on your own or hire a guide to take you out. That's what we hope the Stevens and Smith Center can become. There's another facility being built in Wrightsville called the Mifflin House across the river in York County. It will be a hub right down the road from Gettysburg to tell that story of the bridge burning and all those activities. Yes. Questions online? Well, let's go with those folks. Good question. Was that not on one of the slides? I don't know if I wasn't looking around. We're cross our fingers, fall of 2025 is what we're projecting right now. And we will be done. We started construction, and construction is stabilizing and pouring floors and stabilizing everything. But 6 months before opening, the place has to be like an operating room when you install all of the lights and the projectors and the artwork and all that. So that's kind of the deadline we're facing right now. But that's hopefully will happen. We're still raising the money. If anybody's interested, we have pledge forms here and all that stuff. Yes, ma'am, sir.
Are you aware of any underground railroad activity in either Montgomery or Boston?
I can't really recite, Montgomery or Bucks. No, well, I'm sure people in the room know some, but I can't tell any, I'm sorry?
There's a home in Quakertown and a book written by Thomas Law, MLL,
Okay,
that documents actually an established business that was at the front in certain respects.
in Quakertown?
For receiving folks on the Underground Railroad
Mhm.
and actually providing long-term employment.
Yeah,
And it's a house from the old Bethlehem Pike.
and the family involved at that was who? Okay, Moore, M-O-O-R-E? Okay, good chance. Okay, great. Yeah, there's so many stories that have already been documented in the books I showed you, and so many more. I don't have the breadth of knowledge to show, to relate those details of other areas outside of what I've been focusing on along the border counties, which is pretty much where I've been working. But you can find almost any community, any county history book will tell you, the stories that are out there that have been written so far. Oh, yeah, it's great. It's remarkable. Park Service always does a good job. We have a film critic here who doesn't like the actual movie of Harriet Tubman that was done. Yes, ma'am, another question online. Okay. Good question. Good question. Yeah, thanks for that. Well, okay, what's the best path to research these properties, again, some of which are shrouded in rumor and oral tradition, which again, we can't discount rumors and oral tradition because every piece of mythology has some scrap of truth as you take it back in time. But Underground Railroad is particularly tough to document. So what you have to do is look at the house, the place, if you're trying to document a piece of property, the age of the house, obviously, it has to be not prior, but pretty much prior to the Civil War, certainly 1850 and before. You need to find out who owned it, who built it, and who owned it subsequently. And then from that, when you have that chain of title, which is available in public records and pretty much online, in almost every county has good public access online where you can find the chain of title, who bought, who sold, when. You have the names. You can then go to newspapers.com, which is available through, and ancestry.com, which is available through the archives of the state of Pennsylvania. You're a Pennsylvania employee, you can get access, or I'm sure you can come to a facility like this. If you're in a very private membership organizations have online access to those amazing databases where you just put in a name and a year and you can come up with some remarkable things. When you find out who the people are, you can go to those county history books and look up those biographical sketches of those people, and you need to find out what their politics were and what their religion was, because this was many ways, shape, or form, a religiously inspired civil rights movement that's from the very beginning. And it was racially integrated, as I said earlier. It was Black and white people working together under this understanding that how do we have this country, all men are created equal, and we have this institution of slavery. So those movements of people started being active, getting their names in print, and they have created a record of what they had done in that period of time. Look up William Still's book. They all have indexes, and you can look at them and find out if anybody in particular you know of, or a property owner that you know of, had a connection. It seems that, well, radical Republicans and Whigs were the political people who came out of that, and Thaddeus Stevens, under some weird situation, dabbled in nativism for some weird reason, which we're still trying to understand, when he was a Whig congressman, which was his first federal job, first congressional job as a Whig, later became a Republican. If you were a Democrat back then, you were most likely pro-slavery, owning people, which is so unfortunate. Let's see, what else? That's pretty much, if you get those pieces of bits of information to then build a story around, you can come up with a credible story and keep poking around. But the Holy Grail is diaries and letters that might still be available in somebody's attic somewhere. So with the cistern in downtown Lancaster, we're hoping that when thousands of people come through that museum, someone's going to say, hey, my great somebody or another had a letter or had something that said they came to Lancaster and someone told them to climb into that cistern thing and hide from the bad guys. Because that thing, it seems to have been set up right in the wake of the fugitive slave law, when there would have been a lot of activity where people needed to have hiding places. So, but anybody claiming little hidey holes are proof of Underground Railroad because someone told you way back then, grain of salt, and check it out before you dive into that story. Yes, ma'am, way in the back. Yep. Good point. Thank you. Okay, what was the penalty if you were caught harboring someone? Well, it depends on what year it took place, because again, the US Constitution didn't specifically address slavery, but it allowed it to occur absent any other kind of activity that would have been a local law that was set up. In Pennsylvania, we had what are called personal liberty laws that challenged the federal government's countenance of slavery through the Constitution. Personal liberty laws prescribed that if you as a Black person, escaped slavery, came to Pennsylvania, if you could show that you lived here for 6 months or longer, this is, I'm not sure what exact time period this was, 18 teens, 20s, 30s, then Pennsylvania laws and the courts would protect you from being taken back. That became challenged in a case that rose out of York County called the Prigg case, P-R-I-G-G, that finally was resolved in favor of slavery in the end. But then the Fugitive Slave Law, 1850, was this turning point situation, because every territory that wanted to become a member of the Union, the big issue was, should it, in that time period, should it become a state that allows slavery or not? So California coming in 1850, it was negotiated through Congress that California would come in as a state where slavery was not allowed, but that triggered the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law. The Southern folks said, if you want to have this big territory that's coming in that doesn't allow slavery, we want to be able to go anywhere in the country under the federal law and capture people and take them back. And so that's what set in that motion, that compromise happened, that set in motion the Fugitive Slave Law. So that was the thing that made people scatter. There were people all along in Pennsylvania who were living in relative okay situations, so to speak. I mean, of course, you don't know, but better than they were in the South at that time, 1850. A lot of people had property. They were working on cooperatively with white farmers who had land, and they were tenant farmers and sometimes collaborators. They all took off. I mean, legions of people left places like Gettysburg and York and Lancaster when this Fugitive Slave Law happened, because they wanted to get away, because they knew people were getting kidnapped left and right. Yes, yeah. Thank you, because I didn't answer your question. Sorry. You could get fined heavily, and you could get your property taken. You could be, taken to court. And thank you very much. Appreciate that. But that's kind of the situation. Yeah. Oh.
And the Underground Railroad Center outside of Longwood Garden.
Yeah, that would have been the Longwood Progressive Meeting. And there's a new visitor center there that has a really good display that I understand. I haven't been there, but I know that some of the folks who worked on it, and I'm confident that they did a good job. There's that. So again, we're building this placement of a regional presence of this story, which hopefully more teachers are going to start taking their kids to this subject, which we're working on different levels in our area. Yes, you have another question?
This sort of fact that like Sherry became his name, Columbia,
very good. Yep. One vote. Okay. The point was Columbia was called Wright's Ferry because of that early ferry, but the folks were trying to organize an effort because they were still looking, where do we plant the U.S. Capitol? And there were people from this faction of Congress wanted it here, other people there. They were short by one vote of naming Columbia Wrightsville as the nation's capital. in 80 something or whatever. But yeah, good point. Just think about what this area would be like if that had happened. Unbelievable, unbelievable. And again, a lot of it was the anti-German, it was the travel. People were all concerned about how do you get to the capital to have a Congress? That was one of the big factors. But I also understand there was some anti-German influence that maybe the New Englanders didn't like the presence of the German community in the Pennsylvania area. I think you can check me out on that. I'm not exactly sure. Yes, you had another question?
And a question.
Uh-huh.
You're a great storyteller.
Thanks.
Storytelling, my future and go out, but if I thought it was preteens and teens starts to now through the construction.
Yep.
Final,
Mhm.
how can we get someone such as you directly or someone else who can maybe keep them engaged?
Yeah, great idea. Well, we try to do that as much as possible now. We have regular tours in downtown Lancaster, 2 tours actually, one focusing on the center city with mostly Underground Railroad stories, and then another one in the southeast section of Lancaster, which was the neighborhood that was hugely disrupted by the urban renewal program. And also the 20th century African-American experience is told on a walking tour there. That group, which we work with a lot, they also just got a bus donated to them, a 14-passenger van that will be taking people around so we can see more sights and in the air-conditioned comfort in these days of now, yes. Yep, you can contact me. I can also give you a card up here. Contact me and I would be in a position to hook you up with the African-American storytellers and organize a collaborative tour of some kind. We would do it on a custom basis. The African-American Historical Society does tours on the first Saturdays of the month between May and November that operate out of the visitor center in downtown Lancaster. There's 2 of them each day, each one of those Saturdays. But that's a limited time period. And some places we have storytellers at some of these sites that you go to, and people tell you stories there and take you guided around to the various sites. Mm-hmm. You're so welcome. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Okay. I will let you dismantle the technology.